Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you once again for joining an Austar webinar. And it's a real privilege today to bring you Ashley Church. And before I introduce Ashley, I want to just apologise for the technology we're using this morning. It's not up to our normal studio standard, and I'm doing this remotely. I'm in Australia, and for some reason my laptop wouldn't work, so I've switched over to my phone. So just please accept my apologies around that. Look, it is a real privilege to welcome Ashley. There's probably some people that have joined today that have already heard Ashley talk with us previously, and I know the response from last time was huge, and I don't expect it'll be anything different today. Ashley, for those who don't know, is an inspiring and influential commentator in the real estate market, but not only on real estate. He talks about a lot of social issues. He talks a bit of politics as well. I find that sort of sneaks in a little bit from time to time, but I think it's all part of the mix. You know, real estate is not a segregated issue for a lot of people. It's just part of the puzzle of life in some respects, and Ashley does a really good job, I think, of bringing that all together for us. Ashley, you know, we've named today's topic changing market. So let's cut to the chase. You know, we've seen a period from, if we go back to, I think we spoke to you last October, and we talked about a market that could be coming upon us and changing. And you were pretty accurate, I must say, in your prediction on what might happen. What are your feelings now? What are you seeing, or what do you see as that has panned out already this year, and what might pan out towards the rest of the year?
Yeah, thanks, Len. So let me presage that by saying that we need to be very careful not to judge the market by the events of the moment, or indeed the headlines at the moment. I was writing an article yesterday about where we're at right now, and if you were to look at the headlines that we're currently seeing, it's all doom and gloom, and the sort of expectancy around what will happen next. And I think I made the comment there that it's kind of the equivalent of having a kid in the back seat of the car saying, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" And if you're a parent, you know, you've done that, and the answer to that is no. We'll be there when we're there. And we're kind of in that space at the moment. And it's really interesting when you look at what the headlines are telling us now relative to what they were telling us 4 months ago, and the issues that we were concerned about 4 months ago. And 4 months ago, as you'll well remember, Len, we were worried about runaway house prices. We were worried about the fact that the market had a really strong head of steam on it. And the issue du jour, the issue of the day back then, was around the poor first-time buyers, because they were never going to be able to afford to buy a house again. So, you know, we fast forward 4 months, and it's a completely different environment because of different factors and different things taking place in the economy and politically. And so there's a different set of warnings, and now we're all scared. You know, now we're all worried about what the implications of that are. And so for me, the big takeaway on that is, as I say, don't judge what's going on by the events of the day, because it's changing all the time. And you know, hopefully you and I will talk again at some stage in the future, and when we have that conversation, we'll be talking about different things. It won't be the things that we're talking about today. And as much as I reinforce that message, still doesn't entirely get through, and there'll be people watching today who will be worried, and they'll be worried because they're going to be worried. So in answer to your question, the changing market, there are some concerns and some issues right now which are absolutely and definitely impacting on the market, and will have a little bit of an impact for some time yet. And if we expand this conversation, I'm happy to talk about those. But they're not issues forever. They're issues for right now. They will be resolved, and there'll be a whole different set of things that worry us for whatever set of reasons. We do have a bit of a tendency, both as Australians and New Zealanders, to worry. Regardless of if it's doing well, we worry. The market's doing well, we worry. If the market's doing badly, we worry. So whatever happens, we worry. But at the moment, the worry is about some things that appear to have slowed the market down. Yeah,
so true. All right. Well, you know, we've just from our side of the equation, we've experienced lower numbers at open homes like everyone else. Our auction clearance rates have come down like everyone else. Our sales volumes have come down like everyone else. And I noted the Real Estate Institute figures for January showed Auckland had a 45% decline in sales volume for the month. They're pretty significant changes. And I guess it's been easy to sort of lay that at the feet of the credit law changes, and you might want to talk a little bit around that. And I'm really interested to see that if you feel it's all based around that, or you've got other things that you could attribute to those significant changes that have happened.
So two things for me, and that's one. There are two things, and just to give a little bit of context to that. If you look at the market over the last, and I rabbit on about this every time I talk, so if I'm covering ground we talked about last time, my apologies. But if you look at the history of the market over the last 40 odd years in New Zealand, there's some pretty, and I know how people hate it when I say this, but it's just true. There are some pretty predictable trends that come through in roughly 10-year cycles. It's not exact, it's not a science, but there is enough of a pattern that you can draw some inferences about what our market does. And generally, some exceptions around some parts of the country, but generally the market doubles and more every 10 years, regardless of where you are in New Zealand. There were some exceptions to that a couple of decades back, but it's certainly been true over the last little while. And obviously over the last 12 or 18 months, that rate of growth has been even faster. But the other thing that comes through really strongly is that if you try and understand why that growth has taken place, and this was a sort of a Damascus conversion for me, it didn't happen straight away, but one of the things I sort of came to terms with about 7 or 8 years ago was that the majority of the growth that takes place in house prices in New Zealand has been born on the back of decreasing interest rates. So as interest rates have come down and people have had, and wages have gone up, although obviously not by the same degree, and people have had more ability to borrow more and spend more, we've seen that feed its way through into asset prices. So house prices have gone up in correlation to interest rates coming down, mortgage interest rates, which back in the 80s were very high, back around in the mid 80s, they were sitting at 20-21%. They got as low as very, very low numbers in the last 4 or 5 years. And so that's driven that increase in house prices. So if you extrapolate from that, then you look at what's happened over the last 3 or 4 months by the Reserve Bank, and that's been this very clear message from the Reserve Bank that it's going to start increasing interest rates. If you buy into the idea that decreasing interest rates have driven house prices up, caused house prices to increase, then the corollary of that is that if interest rates go up, in theory, that also has an impact on house prices in the other direction. And I think there's a playing out of that taking place right now, not necessarily with house prices dropping to any significant degree, but certainly that heat that was in the market last year has disappeared as a result of the fact that A, rates really are going up, but B, that even if they haven't gone up to any great degree, there is a fear that they will keep going up. In fact, the Reserve Bank has said that it's going to increase rates by about 0.25% a quarter, so that's 2% a quarter up until 2024. I think if you add that up, it comes to about 1.75%. So there's a real fear that that's going to impact on the cost of borrowing and therefore on house prices. And it's interesting to understand why that's taken place. It hasn't taken place because the Reserve Bank's trying to deal with the property market. If you read media, you would think the Reserve Bank has done this as a way of somehow controlling house prices. Nothing could be further from the truth. The reason the Reserve Bank has done this is because our Reserve Bank, like most Reserve Banks in the Western world, is independent, and it uses interest rates, mortgage interest rate primarily, but interest rates in general, to squeeze liquidity out of the market, and it does that to kill off inflation. So we've had a big spike in inflation recently. Some of that's imported, by which I mean it's come from other things that are happening around the world, both as a result of COVID and the events in Ukraine. But some of it's as a result of some excessive and some, frankly, foolish spending by our government, and that's why our increase in our inflation rate over the last few months has been higher than some other parts of the world. And so what the Reserve Bank's done is it's used that traditional tool of interest rates, and it's sent a message to the market to say we're going to increase interest rates over the next couple of years in order to squeeze that liquidity out of the market. Now, that's a really blunt instrument, Glenn, but it works. We know it works from 30 years of experience of independent Reserve Banks. And so what will happen is at some stage over the next year or two, inflation will come back under control. We know that. And when that happens, the appetite for the Reserve Bank to keep increasing interest rates will stop. They will sit flat for an unknown period of time. And then at some point, they will start coming down again. And when they start coming down again, they will fuel another round of house price inflation, because we know that's what lower interest rates do and the way that people respond to them. So to answer your question with that big long rant is the change in interest rates has definitely been a contributor. It's changed market sentiment. It's removed a lot of the confidence that was in the market, and basically a lot of people that might otherwise have purchased it are like a deer in headlights at the moment, waiting to see what will happen next. And that comes back to my earlier comment about don't judge the market by what's going on at any particular point in time, because things change. And then the second one, as you just alluded to, is the CCCFA, the Credit Finance Act, and the changes that were made. Now, those are interesting because the changes that were made by the minister and passed into legislation late last year, from memory, the impact of those was entirely predictable. I think anybody who looked at those and had half a brain could have worked out that they were going to have the impact that they inevitably had. But the minister persevered, indicating that he knew better. He didn't. And so we had headlines over Christmas and into January of banks essentially rejecting mortgage applications that only 2 months previously they would have happily accepted. And the reason for that was because there was a much greater degree of scrutiny over applications than had previously been the case as a result of the changes to the CCCFA. So to give you a very simple illustration of that, prior to the implementation of this legislation, banks used to use general formulas. So if you were on a certain income and fit a certain profile, then the same formula generally was applied to you as a borrower. Under the new rules, the banks have taken a much more forensic approach, and they look at individual applications and they drill down quite specifically into what people spend. And that's why you got headlines talking about people spending $187 over Christmas at Kmart, and that being the cause, or spending too much on coffee, or particularly stupidly, you were knocked back because you couldn't afford the loan because you were putting money into KiwiSaver, which was a bizarre and ridiculous position for banks to take. But that was their interpretation of those rules. So what's changed there is that the minister has done a review, a cursory review, has come back, firstly has claimed that the slowdown in credit was nothing to do with the act, which of course is nonsense, but done that. And then claimed that, however, even though it was nothing to do with the act, we are going to make some changes to it, and has made some reasonably practical and good changes which are already being implemented and will have an almost immediate impact on the market. So my expectation is that we will see a return to near normality in lending within a couple of months. And the banks will apply a much more practical and reasonable approach to it.
Yeah, I like that comment because my contacts within that banking industry are telling me that their loan application denials is 46% at the moment, which is significant. And I don't think too many of our listeners or watchers would disagree that the banks won't put up with that. They'll need to open up and start doing business.
Here's an interesting thing about the banks. A lot of us don't understand, but once you understand this, it helps you to understand how this happened. But we think of the banks as one great entity, but there's actually two warring factions within any bank. There's credit or risk, which is tasked with the responsibility that the bank doesn't take on any risk, undue risk. And that's the part of the bank that sort of gained control of this whole equation with the implementation of this bank. And then there's, for want of a better word, there's sales. There's the part of the bank which is tasked with actually lending as much as possible. And they are not just now, they're constantly at war. They're constantly at war. And so the lending part of the bank that's tasked with lending money is wanting to lend as much as possible. And the risk part's constantly putting the brakes on and saying, no, you can't. And the risk part gained more control over the last 2 or 3 months. So I think what will happen is that balance will be restored to some form of normality quite quickly.
Well, good to hear. Just going back on a little bit, you talked about the inflation and the imported inflation, and it was probably one of the things that was on my mind this afternoon to ask is how do you see that outside inflation easing at all? Because obviously the Ukraine war is going on a lot longer than people expected and could go on for quite a long time. And I'll just use that as an example. Are we looking at significant imported inflation for possibly a prolonged period here?
Again, I think we need to be careful not to equate the events of today and extrapolate them out as long-term events. I'll give you a really interesting and a good example of that. Last week, most of your viewers this session will remember that there was a pretty strong message coming from various parties saying, go and fill your tank. Because petrol prices are going up and they may well exceed $3 over the next per litre over the next couple of weeks. So we all did that. We all rushed out. I did it too, by the way. filled our tanks up, save a few dollars on the filling it. The following day, petrol prices came down. And that was partly as a result of the government measures to drop the taxes, but it was also just a reflection of the changing and the volatile international market. So things can change very, very quickly. Look, there is a fairly substantial part of this that's due to what's going on in Ukraine around import inflation, particularly around petroleum and some products that are related to the importing of petroleum. But there's a lot of this. I have a theory on this, and I'm not an economist, so let me just presage in advance by saying that. But I have a theory which goes like this. You'll understand the concept then of quantitative easing, which is this essentially the printing of money, which has been taking place for the last 20 years in Asia and a couple of other parts of the world, and more recently in the US and the UK and Europe. And it's this idea that of printing money in order to fuel growth and demand within an economy. And the reason that hasn't happened traditionally, it's only really started over a relatively recent period of time, is because it was always believed that if you started printing more, and when we talk about printing money, actually, incidentally, it's not real money, it's an increase in the money supply, total money supply. When we do that, the belief always was that would be inflationary, in that if you it printed more money than a dollar was worth less than it had previously been, and therefore, in simple terms, that meant that that another dollar was worth less, and both of them were worth less combined than the previous one had been worth as a whole. So that would be inflation, and that would feed through your economy. And we've witnessed over the last 20 years that hasn't happened to the same degree as most of us would have expected, and that it hasn't been inflation. We've had this period of low inflation and quantitative easing, which has been very stimulating and exciting for banks and for governments around the world, and so they've done more of it. I have a theory that some of what's happening at the moment is a delayed impact of that. I can't prove that, but that there is an inflationary impact, and this is the delayed impact of that starting. So the chickens, to some degree, are starting to come home to roost. Now, whether that's true and how long that will last, I guess time will tell. But the reality is that there has been the impulse of inflation pressures on economies throughout the Western world that weren't previously there. Whether that's the Ukraine war, whether it's the delayed impact of quantitative easing, whether it's simply the fact that there's been sort of an orgy of spending over the last 5 or 6 years, and again, this is just the chickens coming home to roost, time will tell. But whichever of those it is, central banks around the world will deal with it. They'll deal with it using interest rates as a tool by which to do that. And here's the thing, it will work. That will work, and at some point, relatively quickly, we will get inflation back to that 1 to 3% range that is the remit of the New Zealand Reserve Bank.
Oh, it's good to hear. I think everyone wants that result, that's for sure. Let's quickly, and we don't have to dwell on this subject too long, because but I think it's important, the effect of Omicron on the market or people's lives, I think, is quite significant at the moment, and probably part of the fear factor that's holding things down or back, or retarding action. What's your feel on that? Obviously, we're coming through the peak now, but there's other waves coming in Australia over here now. We're seeing it, so we're going to get more and more of this. How do you see this impacting on property?
How widely do you want me to go in terms of my view? I've got quite a strong view on this, but it's a little removed from property, but it will help you understand my property view. So
yeah.
how can find you?
Be careful.
Be in my all right. Well, look, let me be clear. I don't believe that COVID was a pandemic, and the reason I say that, I'm not a conspiracist. I'm not I'm not anti-vax or any of that other stuff. I just remember that when the lockdown first was imposed by governments around the world, it was imposed, and people forget this, it was imposed on the basis that that the deaths would be around 7% of the global population. And those numbers came broadly from what had happened in the Spanish flu in 2018. And if that had happened, the impact of that on the world would have been about 500 million deaths. It was huge. And in New Zealand, it would have been about 500 million. So governments that moved their countries into lockdown were absolutely right to do so. Based on those numbers, there was no question that we had to, and not knowing what the actual impact was going to be, it was absolutely right of governments, including the New Zealand government, to go into lockdown. But we know, a year on, we know what the figures are, and they're nothing like that. Nothing like that. The total incidence of deaths from Omicron and Delta over the last 18 months is about 5.5 million, just over 5.5 million, which is a large number, don't get me wrong, it's the population of New Zealand, but it's about 1/100th of what we believed it was going to be. Now, that's not anybody's fault. I'm not blaming anybody for that, but the reality is that the impact of this thing has actually been way less than we thought it was going to be. And if you contrast those numbers with other deaths from other causes in that same period of time internationally. It's about the fifth biggest killer. And the four causes that killed more people over that period of time actually killed between them 42 million people. And it will kill 42 million again this year and 42 million again the year after. So those are normal diseases. So the point I'm making is not a conspiracy-based one. It's simply saying this thing hasn't had the impact that we believed it was going to have. And so what's happening is governments around the world are recognising that, some more slowly than others, and they're basically saying, hey, look, this thing, the panic's over, we need to remove these restrictions and we need to get on with life. And New Zealand has been slower in doing that than most nations. And I think the reason for that is because, and we all know if we were living here at the time, the government got a very big spike in popularity over its initial response to COVID, I think probably quite rightly. And it's kind of a sugar rush for them. So they believe that if they did the same things again, they'll get the same popularity. It's playing out a bit differently this time. So to answer your question, I think there is still some fear there, but the fear is not necessarily based on real concerns. It's based on some things that happened a year ago that we still haven't completely understood as a nation. How much is that impacting on the property market? I think less now than it was a year ago. And a year ago, the market was actually still operating quite well, even though COVID was a much bigger concern because we didn't have these figures that we've got now. So is it impacting the market? Yes. Is it having a dampening impact on the market? I think probably yes, in concert with some of those other things that we talked about. But is it a huge concern? I don't think so. And in fact, every week that goes by, Omicron and COVID, I think, is becoming a more and more distant memory in terms of the impact that it's having on the economy. I think we're very much on the upside and moving into the next stage of whatever this thing looks like. Apologies for the rant to anybody who was affected by that.
Well, just speaking from my personal experience here in Australia at the moment, you'd have to agree that if that is definitely the feeling here, it's the way it's moving. Look, I want to stay with this topic and the inflation topic just for a little bit longer, because I think there is another connection that hasn't been really discussed yet. And that's around the supply chain issues that we've got and the impact that has on the cost of buildings and new construction and all that. Do you want to make a comment around how you see that maybe playing out or what's going on in that area so people can understand a little bit of what might play out in the future?
So there's two issues with regard to supply and the impact on new construction. The first of them is around this idea that there's a shortage of meet demand, and if we don't do that, then we're going to continue to have house price inflation and a whole range of other deleterious effects. And the second one is this idea that the inflation which is passing through as a result of COVID and some of the other things that we talked about before is pushing up the cost of construction, and therefore we've got a crisis looming in that houses are going to cost more to build, and in fact contracts that people might have entered into 6 or 12 months ago are already being repriced as a result of that, and developers are either going out of business or exercising clauses within contracts for them to push those prices up. And we're getting headlines from time to time from people saying, I bought a property, I paid the deposit, I thought it was all on, and then suddenly the contract was cancelled on me. So both of those things are at play. The inflationary one's real. And the question is that permanent? In other words, are those cost increases to the cost of construction permanent, or are they the result of some issues around transportation will come back as a result of it, and therefore as the world opens up again to some degree of normality? I think maybe to some degree, perhaps not completely, but I think we can expect that we will see some relief in respect of some of those costs that we've imported. The second one around supply, I've got a slightly more nuanced answer on, because I don't believe, and again, this is one of my views that's out of step with pretty much every other commentator, but I don't believe we've got a supply crisis, and haven't done for a long time. The reason I say that, it's got nothing to do with anything that's happening in the headlines. It's because I actually sat down and did some numbers about a year ago, but longer, actually 2 years ago, and actually worked out how many houses we'd actually built since 1986. And without boring viewers, we actually built between 1986 and 2018 200,000 more homes than we would have required just to stand still. Now, that's not me making those figures up. That's a very simple calculation, which is done by taking the average household occupancy figure from the census and dividing it by the population. So we know how many people told the average household occupancy figure is the number of people that live in a house on census night. And that figure's been coming down since 1986. It was 3.29 people per household in 1986. It's down to about 2.89. Now, the only way that could have happened is if the population of our country had reduced, which it didn't, or if we'd built more houses than we needed. So I'm not tied to this view that we've actually got a shortage of homes. And it's interesting when you track where that belief came from. It's actually got a very interesting history. Most people won't know because they're not old enough. But if you go back to the late 70s, early 80s, it was a Labor Party policy to build 100,000 homes to meet the supply crisis that we supposedly had. Exactly the same figure 30 years earlier. And it turned out, as it transpired going into the 80s and 90s, that there wasn't actually a supply crisis and the market was actually meeting most of that demand. Then in 2012, Shearer and Annette King, who were leading the Labor Party at the time, reintroduced at the Labor Party conference that year this idea that we had a supply crisis, that we had a shortage, and it became the driver behind Kiwi Build, and it became a mantra that everybody simply bought into. National bought into it a couple of years later, and it became very much a driver of the market. But there are very few people actually going and doing the numbers to determine whether that issue is real. And my argument is it was built on a house of cards. The market's proven over the last 30 years that it builds the houses that it requires. It's continued to do that. And it doesn't need government intervention. It just needs the government to leave it alone and basically get on with doing what it always does and does well. The one caveat I would make to that, Len, is that it is possible over the last 20 years in particular that the type of housing has changed, by which I mean developers are recognising that they can make a better margin on building a house at the upper end of the market, and therefore that the construction of lower end houses, euphemistically named affordable homes, has dropped away, and that there may be a shortage or some degree of shortage in that space. But overall, as a market phenomenon, no.
Okay. I guess that leads me to another question, which you prompted me to think about, is that, and it's probably apt that I'm here in Australia with this question, is that there's a fear out there that a lot of people are going to, now that the borders are open and the movement between the two countries is freer, that there will be a bit of a rush or a flow to Australia. I was having conversations with people here, and we were talking about the average salary in Australia versus the average salary in New Zealand. When we Googled it, I was absolutely blown away by the difference. And so I'm curious to know whether you feel that could be a real issue moving forward. Is there going to be a lot of people moving out of New Zealand now? Or what's your thought?
We talk, and that's in the headlines at the moment, the whole issue. But we talk about it like it's a new thing. There's nothing new.
No, it hasn't changed.
That's been going on for 40 years. And in fact, in many respects, New Zealand and Australia are one nation. And I don't mean that in a cuddly, let's all play rugby together way. I mean it in a sort of an EU way, in the way that there's a free transit of people in capital in Europe. There's free transit of people in capital in New Zealand and Australia. That's worked very well for us for as long as the CER, Closer Economic Relations Agreement, was signed back in the 80s. And yeah, there may well be some flow of Kiwis out there. Equally, there may be some diaspora of Kiwis who've been in other parts of the world who would choose, once the borders open back up, to come home as well. And indeed, if you look at our immigration figures over the last decade, we've had massive immigration into New Zealand. I remember the first, I think it was about 2012, 2013, we had about 12,000 people, a net gain of 12,000 people, and that was a crisis, except the following 7 or 8 years, it kept getting bigger and bigger. And it peaked, I think, about 2018 at about 78,000 people. So it was huge. And so I think the real question is not what will happen between Australia and New Zealand, but what will happen to Australia and New Zealand as a result of these being seen as favoured nations and sort of our quiet little corner of the world. And the reality is there will be some impact from that. And that will impact on the property market because people will require roofs over their heads. So I would encourage people not to worry about the Australia and New Zealand thing, because I don't see people going to Perth or Sydney as any different to somebody moving from Auckland to Tokoroa, or well, maybe not Tokoroa, bad example, but Hamilton or Wellington or Christchurch. But in terms of both countries and the property economies of both countries, yeah, we will have some challenges, but they're not to do with what's going on between our family, with Australians and New Zealanders. It's the broader stuff going on internationally.
Great. Hey, just on another very much addressed topic at the moment, that's the cost of living. Obviously, that's inflation linked to a significant degree. But how do you see that impacting on, I guess, especially first home buyers, but how do you see that impacting on the real estate market and people's ability to either buy or sell their house going forward?
Cost of living, you mean in terms of the actual cost of things like paying mortgages and
yeah, well, that's a big part of it, isn't it? But it's just the food, the fuel, everything that is part of our lives. The rents are going up. How are people going to get out of that to go and buy a house with all the pressure that's coming from those rising numbers?
Yeah, I agree. And so, I mean, as the cost of living increases, obviously it makes it more difficult for people to do things like, pay down a mortgage and do some of those other things that you would expect. It's interesting because when you look at an economy, New Zealand, Australia, anywhere in the Western world, there's no perfectly balanced economy. Economies are the sum total of a series of choices that governments make around what they need to spend in different areas versus how much money they should and could leave in the pocket of these. And nobody gets it perfect. New Zealand and Australia have actually done that pretty well for about 30 years. New Zealand and Aussie are examples of sort of a hybrid between capitalist and socialist economies, by which I mean we both recognise that we don't want the most vulnerable to suffer, and therefore we should provide enough of a safety net to make sure that those people are looked after, but that by and large we should try and keep our economies efficient and keep the cost of taxation down so that people can get on with their lives and manage them as they do best. And I would argue, and again I'm getting into politics, but I would argue we've lost sight of that over the last 4 years and that we have strayed way too far. I'm not so familiar with the Aussie situation, but in New Zealand, way too far over the sort of the managed state approach, and that's fed into the impost of regulations and costs which are driving what you're talking about, which are driving an increase in cost of living. And I'll give a really good example of that. We've got a government that came in on the back of a whole range of claims, one of which was that it was going to fix the rental housing market, and it was going to make things easier for tenants. Now, the result of that 4 years later is that we're seeing average rental increases of $50 per week per year in New Zealand over the last 4 years. The average in the 10 years prior to that was $12 per week per year. So it's a massive increase, and that hasn't happened in isolation. It's happened because we've got legislation driving things which are about making things harder for property investors and landlords, and in theory making them easier for tenants, but increasing the cost of tenants when it gets to the sharp end of that cost. So the answer to your question about it is a lot of that stuff we've done to ourselves. It hasn't happened in isolation. It hasn't happened by chance. We have almost in a strategic way gone about actually increasing the costs of being citizens of society to a point where we're actually now driving some of those cost of living increases. And the solution to that is to start to roll some of that back. And the sooner that happens, the sooner we'll get back to that kind of balance that we've had over the last 30 years. And incidentally, when I talk about that balance, that's an apolitical comment, because both Labor and national governments, going back to 1990, adopted a very similar economic orthodoxy. They both, although they argued that each was doing more or less of things they should or shouldn't have been, in terms of the way they ran the economy, the approach that they took was almost identical. It's only in the last 4 years that we have significantly departed from that economic orthodoxy, and we're now seeing the results of that.
Right. I had the privilege of listening to your OneRoof show a couple of weeks ago, and I picked up on in that chat that you were really talking about this change as being a short change, and I don't know if you use the word transition, but it's probably what we've been using in our business. We're calling it a transition. Probably two questions out of that is: first one is, do you see it as still as a short change after a few weeks further down the tracks, and why? And secondly, how long, or have you noticed in the past how when a market goes from being a seller's market to I hate calling it a buyer's market because it's not quite there yet, but we are moving in that direction. How long have those sort of transition periods taken in the past? Do you have any
Let's deal with the second question first, and I may get you to remind me what the first question was, but let's deal with the second one. And so it's important to understand, if you buy into this idea of cycles, and again, I need to stress, Len, this is very sort of raw stuff. It's not necessarily clinically accurate in every case, but in the very general sense, if we look at the New Zealand market over that 40-year period that I talked about before, and we get that rough doubling of house prices in most parts of the country, the other thing that we know is that, again, very general terms, to those of your viewers who are in Auckland, Auckland's usually 3 years ahead of the rest of the country. So Auckland tends to go into its next boom, or its next boom cycle, about 3 years ahead of the rest of the country, and then it will flatten at some point. So if we, for the purposes of demonstration in this exercise, if nothing else, let's say there's a 10-year period where house prices double. 6 or 7 of those years, house prices will be increasing. 3 of them, house prices will be flat. And then for the rest of the country, same cycle, but about 3 years behind. So you would expect that when Auckland was flattening off, the rest of the country would continue to increase for another 3 years, and then it would also flatten off just as Auckland was coming into its next boom. If you accept that, then in 2020, and if you read any of my writings going back into the 2017, 18, 19, I was saying this consistently. In 2020, Auckland, between 2017 and 2020, had been in a flat period. And when you look at the graphs, you can see that demonstrated way better than I can express it. Very, very clear that they were in a flattening period. So you would have expected in 2020, maybe 2021, the Auckland market would have started to pick up again, and would have carried on increasing. The values would have carried on increasing for 5 or 6 years before it flattened off at the end of its next cycle. And it did. The Auckland market started picking up 2020-21. Last year was a really good example of that. But what you also would have expected is you would have expected most of the regional markets to flatten off, because they'd had 6 or 7 really good years, and it was time for them to flatten off and to stay flat for 2 or 3 years. That didn't happen. The reason it didn't happen, I think, is because the Reserve Bank lowered the cost of money, and there was a whole range of other stimuli into the market, which fueled the spending, feeding frenzy, and so we had that extra year of exceptional growth of 29% in some parts of the country, increases in house prices. Now that those markets have flattened off, the question is what happens now. So if the market follows its normal trajectory, Auckland should recover from this pretty quickly, shake itself off and carry on going up, albeit not, in my opinion, not anything like the same sort of growth it's had in the last 12 months, but will continue to increase. The rest of the country, if you follow that analogy, should stay flat for 3 years, 3 or 4 years. So in theory, if that's correct, then if you live outside Auckland, in the most parts of the country outside Auckland, your market's going to be flat for a few years. If it follows the trajectory it has over the last 3 or 4 decades. Auckland's the outlier on this, because the question is, does Auckland stay flat? Or, and I use this example a lot, is it simply the teeth of a serrated saw? Which I mean, if you think of a saw, you think of that saw pointing upward, and you think of the teeth on the saw going like this. That's what the market does all the time. It's constantly going up and down little increments, but the direction of it is upward. I'm arguing that's what's happening with Auckland right now. It's having a bit of a flattening period, but if we were to see that graph in 12 months' time, we would see that it took a little bit of a dive in January, February, March, but the general trend was up, whereas the rest of the country will stay flat. Now, that's just an opinion. Might turn out to be completely wrong, but that would be my assessment of what I think is likely to happen.
Dare I say that's a typical economist comment, based predicting the future on what's happened in the past. I was listening to you thinking, that term that's been used so much over the last 2 years. We live in unprecedented times, and how much that will impact on the market going forward. But
you're quite right. Carry on.
Nobody's got a crystal ball, and we won't have a check on you in a year's time or 6 months' time or whatever. That's for sure.
Well, do stick it in your diary.
We'll take the challenge up.
I'm always happy to be wrong there.
Yeah, me too.
But let me just pick up on that point, because in my experience, in fact, the opposite is the case. That economists, although they will talk about previous trends, they tend to qualify it. I don't. My argument is every time because I'm 58 now, I've been through 4 of these things. Every time we go through another one of these and it does the same thing, it strengthens my arm in terms of my view. So I'm a crotchety old man on this stuff now, because I've seen 4 of them and they've done more or less the same thing. So my argument is, look, is it guaranteed to be the same again? No. Is it likely? Yeah, that's why, because that's the experience of the last 4 cycles. It's done pretty much the same thing. And that's actually not the economist's view. The economists will tell you that they'll report that it's done that, but they'll say because of these factors, it could do something different. And then, of course, it does. It does what it previously did. The other question you asked me was, you asked me 2 questions.
Are you still confident about the shortness of the change in the market, really? That was the
which I kind of answered with that question,
yeah.
was to say that I think Auckland will recover from this and will keep going up, which incidentally, if you read social media, I've been totally slagged for it, but that's okay. I'm quite happy. I'm quite happy to take the good with the bad. But I'm still of the view that the Auckland market, if we look back at the end of this financial year, at the end of this calendar year, we will see that the Auckland market later in the year shrugged most of us off and had more modest gains, but still had gains, and the rest of the country will have stayed flat for a while if that trajectory follows previous patterns. So let's wait and see if that actually happens.
For what it counts, I agree with you. So, I'm not challenging you because I don't agree with it. That's for sure. Look, I should have said something at the beginning, and maybe I still have time to do it because I've got a couple more questions. But before I ask those questions, people that have got questions of their own, please put them in the chat box. In this situation that I'm in with the technology, I'll have to rely on my assistant back in Auckland to maybe turn her mic on. Gemma, turn her mic on and ask those questions to you, Ashley, if we can make that work. Yeah. But while people are maybe posting their questions up in the chat box, there's one more question, or there's 2 more questions that I would pose to you. And I know these are very broad sort of questions, but if you were in the shoes, or if you were a person that was contemplating selling now in Auckland, or you're actually on the market selling, you're in the process already, what sort of thoughts would you be having? What would you be thinking about what you should be doing?
Well, firstly, I would, if it were me, I'd be making sure I was doing it for the right reasons. It's probably the wrong thing to say on a real estate presentation, but for me, it's really important that if people are selling because they're panicked, they shouldn't, for a whole range of reasons. If they're panicking, if they're investors, for example, and they think their portfolio is going to tank, or they're relatively new first-home buyers and are worried that the house is going to lose its value, the smartest move is to hang on to that property for the foreseeable future, because the market's proved to us that the trajectory is always up. But people sell for other reasons. They sell because they need to move. They sell for lifestyle reasons, to do with children, or wanting to down. So there's all sorts of reasons. For those people, pretty much nothing changes. And the reason I say that, particularly if you're within the same area, if you're buying within the same location, then you're buying and selling in the same market. So if I've got a residential home in Auckland right now, and I need to sell that property to buy another one, if there's a 3 or 4% difference in the price that I paid for it now, there's going to be a 3 or 4% difference in the property that I buy as well, if I'm smart and I'm astute. So I wouldn't be too concerned. Look, the main thing is take good advice from professionals, agents, accountants, etc. Make sure that you're cognizant of what's going on. But the most important information, or the most important advice I could give right now, Len, is don't panic. For God's sake, don't panic. There's no reason to panic right now. There's actually nothing happening beyond those 2 things that I talked about, which were the Credit Finance Act, which is in the process of being changed, and the incremental increases to interest rates. There's actually nothing happening. There's not an Asian financial crisis or a global financial crisis meltdown or any of those other things which have happened in the past taking place right now. So I would be trying to look at this objectively as I could, and making decisions on good information, not based on the headline that I read yesterday that said that the market's going to tank.
Great advice, very sound advice. Thank you. The last question I have is, I'm going to jump to the other side of the fence now. You're a buyer. You're one of those rare buyers that's got pre-approval. They've got the go button pressed. What would your attitude be if you're in that position?
It's kind of the same again, but slightly different. It's the same in that as a buyer, the market actually hasn't changed. Somebody said to me the other day, should we wait for the prices to drop? For God's sake, no. And they might drop, but don't get me wrong, they might drop 4 or 5%, but in the long run, that would be way too big a risk for me to take. When I look at the history of the market over the last 40 years, and I see that that market's trajectory has been up, the last thing I would be doing is suggesting to somebody that they should be waiting right now, regardless. So if you were going to buy and you think for some reason that there's going to be some bargain, and you can wait around for a few months or a year, and until you can sort of pick up the spoils of the drop in the market, good luck with that. The property market is littered with the bones of people who tried that in the past unsuccessfully. So do not do that. If you want to buy. And do that now. The only caveat I would put to that is there is some uncertainty right now, and I don't think that's going to last more than a couple of months, but it's there right now, which means that you can probably be a little bit more cheeky in your approach to purchasing now than you'll be able to be in 2 months' time, because there is a perception in the market at the moment that prices are a little bit unstable. So I would, if I was a buyer, I'd be looking to take advantage of that. But I think your window of opportunity to do that is literally a couple of months. The market will have recovered to a point where that opportunity is gone.
Well, thank you, Ashley. Once again, apologies that I can't see the questions, but Gemma, are there questions there that you want to come on and ask Ashley on behalf of our viewers?
There's no questions in the chat box, but yeah.
Right.
I can read that one of two ways. I'm not sure which one. But, hey, by the way, one thing I would add too, and I should have put it at the beginning, it's important, is that I'm not an economist. I don't have an economist degree. My experience and my opinions on the property market are entirely drawn from practical experience over the last 40-odd years. They're observations and they are opinions. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not qualified under New Zealand legislation to give advice. So I'm always happy to have these conversations, but people need to keep that in mind when they are considering what I may or may not have said, and whether or not they're going to be influenced by that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's your disclaimer put in there. Hey, look, well, I'll just finish by saying, or sticking my neck out here, saying I think you've answered a lot of people's thoughts or questions that they might have had anyway. Actually, I really do. So on behalf of my team and on behalf of all the guests that we've got on the webinar today, really appreciate you giving up your time and spending it with us. As usual, some really golden points in there, and it makes, this is my opinion, my disclaimer, but it makes a lot of sense, mate. And really appreciate what you've done for us today. So I'm sure we'll come back to you in maybe 3 to 6 months' time and have another chat and talk about where we are at that point.
Always good fun, Len. Appreciate it very much.
No worries. Thank
All
you.
right,
Bye.
Ta-da.